this was the last slide you guys saw on screen, right? We just finished talking about prokaryotes, and we were about to go into eukaryotes. Hopefully everybody remembers the difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes. We've gone over this several times now. As far as where they came from, though, this was, I guess, basically a mystery, is the best word for it, up until relatively recently. We knew the differences between eukaryotes and prokaryotes, and we knew that prokaryotes existed before eukaryotes, but we didn't really understand how eukaryotes came to be. How did something as simple as a prokaryote end up evolving into something so much more complex with all these membrane-enclosed organelles inside the cell? So this nerd came up, well, she didn't really come up with the idea of endosymbiosis. It had actually been proposed about 100 years earlier, but no one took it seriously at all until she took up the mantle in the 1960s. So the theory of endosymbiosis basically states that these large, complex, highly evolved eukaryotic cells were the result of symbiotic merger of multiple prokaryotic cells, meaning that it's basically thought that at some point in history, eukaryotic or prokaryotic cells, something like a bacterium, engulfed another smaller bacterial cell, and it survived inside of the one that just ate it. And they started working together. That's what the theory of endosymbiosis states.
So this isn't mixing DNA, this is just one living inside another?
Right. So sort of a really impossible and crazy analogy for this would be, imagine if you were to eat a plant and then somehow the plant stayed alive inside of you and retained the ability to photosynthesize. Would be really cool, wouldn't it? Yeah. Anyway, her work was not initially accepted. In fact, one of her grant applications once received a reply saying, quote, "Your research is crap, don't bother to apply again." So there was a lot of pushback against this at first. However, in the 80s, she was vindicated through newly acquired genetic evidence that really substantiated the theory of endosymbiosis pretty well. And it's now the prevailing theory on the origin of eukaryotes. It's still, I mean, still not something that's completely understood. This is still a pretty rapidly developing field of biology, trying to study exactly how and exactly when this happened.
Do we know how it would be that now eukaryotic cells have the DNA to code for those smaller organelles?
So we'll get a little bit into that, but remember that things like mitochondria and chloroplasts actually have their own DNA. Now that was not supposed to be on this slide. Hang on a second. Go away. Delete. Oh, it's over here. I hate that. Yes, PowerPoint, I trust the source of this file. I made it. Okay. So mitochondria are one of the really good examples of the theory of endosymbiosis. We think that they probably existed or originated as a free-living prokaryote at some point in history. And there's a lot of evidence to substantiate that idea. How they came to be an organelle inside of another cell, we basically think that at some point a larger prokaryote just engulfed these, and they survived within that prokaryote, thereby giving the host the ability to use oxygen in order to process energy. Because remember that mitochondria are the organelles involved in cellular respiration. So as the early atmosphere, or the atmosphere of early Earth, was being more and more oxygenated, it would have been useful for these other organisms to be able to use that oxygen to access the energy in organic molecules. Having something like a mitochondria living in you would give you that ability. It turns out also that most mitochondria are shaped like a specific group of bacteria. They look very similar. They have these double membrane layers, with the inner one being really folded. Additionally, mitochondria actually divide on their own. The cell does not produce additional mitochondria when it divides. It's the mitochondria themselves that divide through a process that looks a lot like binary fission. What's binary fission?
Prokaryotes.
That's the way prokaryotic cells divide. Also, as I just mentioned, mitochondria have their own DNA. Not only that, but their DNA exists as a single circular chromosome, very similar to what we see in prokaryotic cells. They also have their own ribosomes and their own transfer RNA molecules. And their ribosomes and tRNAs also very closely resemble what we see in prokaryotic organisms. So there's a lot of strong evidence here pointing to the idea that these things probably were at one point their own free-living organisms and were just sort of brought into function as part of something larger. Now we see something similar when we look at chloroplasts. What do chloroplasts do? Where do you find them? Stromas contain living chloroplasts. Chloroplasts are found in plant cells. They're the organelle responsible for photosynthesis, right? These are also thought to have originated as a free-living prokaryote. It turns out that chloroplasts are very similar in both size and shape to cyanobacteria. Hopefully you guys remember that cyanobacteria are prokaryotes that are capable of photosynthesis. They both have an inner and outer membrane layer. They both have a lot of the same stuff on the inside. So it's probably way too small for you guys to read. You can trust me later. So they both contain thylakoids, they both contain ribosomes, they both have a nucleoid region. Chloroplasts and cyanobacteria are very similar to each other. They also contain their own DNA in the form of a single circular chromosome. And they also divide by a process fairly similar to binary fission. So just like the mitochondria, we see a lot of really strong evidence here suggesting that these things were probably at one point a free-living prokaryote, which was just absorbed into a larger organism in order to, gain its power or its ability to photosynthesize. Now the chloroplasts in red and green algae even have DNA sequences that are really closely related to cyanobacteria. Remember, algae are sort of the evolutionary precursor to terrestrial plants. So it would make sense that if red and green algae are relatively recent descendants of the endosymbiotic event that gave a larger organism, chloroplast, to form photosynthesis, it would make sense that they would have fairly similar DNA to the other free-living photosynthetic prokaryotes that still exist.
So they most likely have a common ancestry.
What?
They most likely have a common
Yeah,
ancestry.
they most likely have a fairly recent common ancestry. So this is the basics of what endosymbiotic theory entails. So you have what they term here a proto-eukaryote, which is something that would have existed before eukaryotes and later sort of evolved into them. You would see that they have a bunch of infoldings of their membrane that give rise to the endomembrane components. Hopefully you guys at least remember the words endomembrane system. That was one of the things we went over very early in the semester. That includes things like the endoplasmic reticulum. So these infolding of the membrane would give rise to some things like the endoplasmic reticulum. Then eventually, they would sort of just suck in this aerobic bacterium. Aerobic meaning something that can use oxygen in order to perform cellular respiration to process energy. And it would survive inside of it. Ends up dividing in there, now you have multiple mitochondria. Here we see a photosynthetic bacterium being engulfed and surviving inside the cell. Now we have something much more complex containing both mitochondria and chloroplasts, and that is what we would call our modern photosynthetic eukaryote. Oops. Anyway, I wanted to go over also the fact that it's thought that the first endosymbiotic event probably, or at least rather the endosymbiotic event leading to mitochondria probably happened earlier than the one leading to chloroplasts. Yes?
So this model has both fungi and
In this case, yes. So here we'd be talking about probably an algae, something like that. Because you only see photosynthetic eukaryotes either in the plants or the algae. Any other questions before we move on? Okay, so this is our best explanation that we've proposed so far as to how eukaryotic cells came to exist. Yes.
there's two kinds of bacteria over here, aerobic and photosynthetic.
Yes. Yeah, that's because the free-living prokaryote that is the precursor to mitochondria would be a different organism from the one with the precursor to chloroplasts. Because remember, mitochondria aren't involved in photosynthesis, they don't have chlorophyll, they can't process light in that way. So it would have to be two entirely separate organisms that were, I guess engulfed is still the best word to use, at different points in evolutionary history. Anything else? All right. So, protists. When I was in school, this was still largely considered to be a kingdom, but it's not anymore. So when I was in school, we had our 5 kingdoms. Now we have a whole bunch of other designations. Basically, protists, and it was always kind of silly that they weren't considered a kingdom, because it included a whole bunch of very diverse and often exceedingly distantly related organisms. Basically, the only thing that all protists had in common was that they didn't fit in any other kingdom. Recent molecular evidence over the last decade or two has demonstrated that some of the things that we had grouped in with the protists are actually more closely related to animals, or more closely related to plants, or maybe even fungi, than they were to other things within their own kingdom. So once enough of this evidence mounted, the kingdom of Protista was basically dissolved. It's now no longer considered to be a kingdom. It is still sometimes used informally, though, to describe the former members of the kingdom of Protista. Sort of like anybody remember when Prince decided to start going by a symbol instead of a word? Guess you know for that? You remember that probably. It was back in the 90s. And the symbol had no word associated with it, so we had to call him the artist formerly known as Prince, and he kept up that nonsense for years. Anyway, the kingdom formerly known as Protista. Yeah, although it's not even a kingdom. As I mentioned, a very diverse and often very distantly related group. Many of the members of the former kingdom Protista do not have much of anything in common with each other than that they're eukaryotes. There are over 100,000 described species in this group. Most of them are unicellular and most of them are microscopic. There are some counterexamples to that though. Things like giant kelp. That used to belong in the kingdom Protista. Obviously giant kelp are not microscopic. They can be 50 meters long. Most of the protists were also aquatic. They either lived in freshwater or marine environments. There are some counterexamples to that as well. Some protists are parasites. Some of them are human endoparasites. One of them is actually responsible for causing malaria. Now, in the book, it gives you a description of a lot of the diverse features and structures and cellular arrangements found in the former protists. I think it's going to be more interesting if we just go through some pictures. This is one of my favorites, the Volvox. It's really cool looking. They actually look like this under a microscope. This is obviously photosynthetic. You can tell from the green color. There's the giant kelp. That's an example of an enormous multicellular protist, which is relatively rare in this group. Because remember, most of them are unicellular and microscopic. Yes?
How is that considered protist?
Because it didn't fit anywhere else. It's not a plant, it's not an animal, it's not a fungus. That really, the kingdom Protista really did basically serve as a catch-all. Like, we can't call it a plant, we can't call it an animal, we can't call it a fungus, we're just going to call it a protist.
What do we know what it's closely related to now?
This is more closely related to plants than anything else. Because obviously it's photosynthetic. It looks fairly like a plant, but it can't be considered technically a plant, at least not in the sense that terrestrial plants are. These days, they tend to be mostly grouped in the plant kingdom though, depending on who you talk to. That's one of the annoying things about taxonomy is it's always changing and not everybody else agrees. Now, just because it's macroscopic, meaning large enough to see, does not mean it's not unicellular. Here's a really weird example. This is Caulerpa. This is a single cell. One of the largest cells known to exist on Earth. It is a single multinucleate cell right there. Pretty wild. This little guy here, Paramecium caudatum. This is a more animal-like protist, so this guy is not photosynthetic. That stuff on the surface that looks like hair, those are actually cilia. That's what allow these things to move around in their liquid environment. They can beat those cilia, kind of flap them like a bunch of tiny little hands, and they can swim through the water. These guys are heterotrophic. They have to eat other organisms. And this is obviously a very enlarged image. They are microscopic.
What is protein?
What?
Where is this located?
So you can find these guys in pond water, stuff like that. Another thing you might find in pond water, and you may have heard of, is the amoeba. Amoeba Proteus. This is another protist. Very different from anything else we've looked at so far. Now, when you look at these guys, that shape is not fixed at all. All of those projections you see that look almost like arms or something, those are called pseudopodia, which roughly translates into false feet if you bring it out of Latin. Those are entirely fluid and changeable. The amoeba has no set shape, and it can sort of stretch out projections of itself to move through its environment or to engulf something that it wants to bring in and eat through phagocytosis. These guys are also interesting. This is a various arrangement of diatoms. Those are actual cells. That's what they naturally look like, these crazy geometric shapes. There are actually people that make microscopic art out of diatoms just by arranging really cool shaped cells. So just there you can see an enormous level of diversity in this group of organisms. So it sort of makes sense when you look at it this way, why the kingdom ended up getting broken up. Yes.
So all these do the exact same thing and the exact same function and way up? No, even though they're all shaped differently.
Yeah. The diatom, they're shaped differently, they behave differently. I don't know enough about diatoms to actually explain the different functions of the different types. But even just within the diatom, you see an amazing amount of diversity. Now, if you compare those guys to that guy or those guys, it makes sense that they're no longer in the same kingdom. Now, as for how protists actually function, much like their morphology, their modes of nutrition are also extremely diverse. So protists can be aerobic or anaerobic. Some of them need oxygen, some of them don't need oxygen. They can be photosynthetic. Those are the plant-like, the algae generally. So they can photosynthesize to produce their own sugars from inorganic molecules. In fact, photosynthetic protists are extremely important to the world. Anybody ever heard of phytoplankton? These are microscopic photosynthetic protists that live in the upper layer of the ocean. They're actually responsible for the majority of Earth's oxygen production. Something like 60% of the world's oxygen is produced by phytoplankton on the ocean surface. They can also be heterotrophic. Examples that we just looked at, like the paramecium or the amoeba. Some of them have a lifestyle that's much more like animals, where they have to find food for themselves and eat it rather than produce it on their own. Not surprising that reproduction in the protist is also quite varied. There's going to be a recurring theme in here where everything that happens in this group of organisms is highly variable. Most protists are capable of some form of asexual reproduction. Some of them reproduce by binary fission, which is where the organism just splits into two identical organisms. Other protists are also capable of something called multiple fission, which is similar to binary fission except it splits into more than two cells at once. Some of them are also capable of a reproductive mechanism called budding, which is where it basically grows a smaller version of itself on the side that just sort of loops off and then grows into a full-size adult. Sexual reproduction is also common among protists. So the basic theme here is that they use basically every form of reproduction there is. Now, I've been mentioning the broad diversity of the group. This phylogenetic tree really kind of brings it home. So this includes all eukaryotic organisms right here. In the past, we've grouped things mostly based on morphological or behavioral differences. But now that we have things like molecular biology, we can sequence DNA, we can sequence amino acids, we can take much more intricate looks at the relationships between and among organisms. That's allowed us to really evaluate how we classify everything. So this is a new emerging classification scheme of the eukaryotes, which groups the whole domain into 6 supergroups. This may be too small for most of you guys to read, but all of these groups are considered monophyletic at this point. What does monophyletic mean? Everything in the group descended from a common ancestor, like a clan. Now, if you look at this, 4 of these 6 groups consist entirely of things that used to be in the kingdom Protista. So they're so diverse that now that we've reclassified everything into these supergroups, 4 of the 6 total supergroups are just made up of former Protists. If you look all the way down here, this is where we are in the supergroup Opisthoconta. We're in here with the fungi. Makes sense because we are heterotrophic. We're also in here with the choanoflagellates, which is the most closely related outgroup to the animals. Plants go in here with the green and red algae. And pretty much everything on there used to be, everything else on there used to be considered a protist. So that sort of tends to drive the point home about how diverse and distantly related many of the protists were. Now, I briefly mentioned that there are some parasitic protists. This is a great example. So there are 4 species in the genus Plasmodium, which are known to cause malaria in humans. So malaria, I'm sure everyone's heard of, it's a horrible disease, kills a lot of people. Not caused by a virus or a bacterium. Instead, is caused by a parasitic protist. Within those 4 species, Plasmodium falciparum causes about 50% of all known cases of malaria. So if you look at this image here, the parasitic protist, by the way, this is an image of red blood cells. The parasitic protist here is the little purple things living within the red blood cells. That's how malaria works. So you get bitten by a mosquito that has one of these worms in it, and it goes into your body and reproduces and infects your blood cells. It reproduces inside of your blood cells, eventually bursting out and destroying them. Okay, where were we? Destroys red blood cells. In some cases, it can destroy more than half of the red blood cells circulating throughout your body, which obviously is going to lead to very severe anemia. Remember, anemia is just low red blood cell count. If you lose more than half of your red blood cells, your count's going to be really low. This is very often fatal. Malaria kills, I think, millions of people every year in tropical regions where the mosquitoes are commonly found. Another parasitic protist is Trypanosoma brucei. There are a few trypanosomes that cause diseases. This one in particular causes something called African sleeping sickness. So in this image here, the parasites are a little bit more obvious. They're these really weird, silky, worm-looking things that obviously aren't supposed to be there. Now, one of the really interesting things about members of the genus Trypanosoma is they actually have this really thick glycoprotein coat, and they change it with every infectious cycle. Which is crazy, because the way your immune system is able to recognize things like that is by proteins on the surface. That's, for instance, how vaccines work. Anyone in here ever gotten a vaccine? I should certainly hope so, at least one. So the way a vaccine works, which protects you against what? Viruses only. So the way a vaccine works is you end up getting injected with a bunch of dead protein codes from dead viruses. That allows your immune system to recognize those protein codes and produce antibodies. Then if a live version of that virus ever shows up in your system, you already have the weaponry necessary to knock it out. So with the immune system functioning by recognizing specific proteins on the surface of some infectious organism or non-organism like a virus, if it's something that can change those proteins with every generation, that keeps your immune system from recognizing it. So this effectively prevents the immune system from ever clearing the infection. Yes?
Does it also mean that we don't have any way of like treating it or curing it or
We
anything?
do have ways to treat it. It can be treated with several different antiparasitic medications. It depends on how bad the infection is, because most antiparasitics have really awful side effects. So, and the most effective ones tend to have the worst side effects. So they will prescribe specific ones based on how bad and how advanced your infection is. But if you don't treat it, this is basically invariably fatal, because it ends up causing severe damage to the nervous system. I think there's only a handful of recorded cases where someone with African sleeping sickness has refused treatment and survived longer than about 15 years. Now, in addition to being, well, any questions on this before we move on? Okay. In addition to being human parasites, protists can also parasitize plants. This one here, Plasmopara viticola, causes a disease in grapes, or grape plants, called downy mildew. Anybody recognize that thing on the right?
It's a potato.
It is a potato. That potato is infected with Phytophthora infestans. I hate saying that one. That causes potato blight. Anybody here have Irish ancestry? Yeah, me too. So, this is what caused the famous Irish potato famine, which was responsible for over 1 million deaths due to starvation. Although a lot of those deaths could have easily been prevented if the British hadn't been deliberately hoarding all of the food in Ireland to make people starve. That's more of a political science issue than a biology issue. But this also caused the emigration from Ireland of about 1 million people trying to escape the potato blight. Most of them came to America. So that was the reason, or one of the main reasons why there's so many people of Irish descent in the United States. Sort of an interesting side note, I can't remember which tribe it was, but one of the Native American tribes during the Irish potato famine felt so bad for them that they raised as much money as they could and sent it over there as famine relief. I think it was like $33 or something like that, which isn't nothing in the 19th century, but it's not a whole lot either. But now there's actually a monument built in Ireland to commemorate the generosity of that Native American tribe. Because those were really poor people too. So the fact that they're like, here, take everything we have, that's really something. Anyway, potato blight caused by a parasitic protist. All right, do we have any questions on protists before we move to fungi? Okay then, so fungi. The word fungus comes from the Latin word for mushroom. In fact, it actually is the Latin word for mushroom. And that makes sense, because when most people hear the word fungus, what they think of is a mushroom, right? Fungi are a lot more than just mushrooms, though. In fact, those mushrooms that everybody thinks of are just the reproductive structure of the fungus. They only exist for a small part of its life cycle. Now, we have about 100,000 described species of fungus in the world, but it's estimated that there are probably more than 1 million of them. We just haven't described most of them yet. And like many things, fungi used to be grossly misclassified. We used to think they were very closely related to plants. A lot of people still do. Because they grow out of the ground, people think if it grows out of the ground, it must be a plant, right? Not always the case. DNA evidence shows that they're actually more closely related to animals than plants. Fungi are more closely related to us than they are to a tree or grass or anything like that. And when you think about it, that makes sense. Because fungi, for one, are not capable of photosynthesis. They cannot use light to produce their own energy. They have to eat something else, just like we do. So they eat complex organic molecules to gain their energy and nutrients, just like animals. They're heterotrophic. The way they do this makes them very important in nutrient cycling. We'll get into that a little bit more a little bit later. But they basically function as decomposers, which are a hugely important link in the food chain. Now, when you get down to the cell structure of fungi, they are eukaryotes, obviously, hopefully that didn't surprise anybody, which means they contain a membrane-bound nucleus and other membrane-bound organelles. They have all the stuff you'd expect to find in a eukaryotic cell, all of the complexity of our own cells. Because they are not plants and they are not photosynthetically active, they do not contain chloroplasts. That's important to know. People always get confused about that. They do have a cell wall. So it may be easy to think that that makes them closely related to plants. But the cell walls in fungi are composed primarily of chitin and glucans. Now, chitin is the same biological material that makes up the primary components of insect and arthropod cell walls. So, like crab shells. Fungal cell walls are made mostly out of the same stuff as crab shells. Obviously, that's different from plant cell walls, which are made of cellulose, right? Also different from bacterial cell walls, which are made of peptidoglycan. Also different from the archaeal cell walls, which are made of pseudopeptidoglycan, or S layers, or other things. A lot of different types of cell walls. The function, however, is relatively similar. So fungal cell walls provide structure for the cell, helps provide structure for the organism. That's why mushrooms can stand up straight without a skeleton. It also protects against desiccation and protects against predation. Some fungi can be very tough and difficult to eat. Other fungi you don't want to eat because they're poisonous anyway. So when we're talking about fungi, for the most part, I'm not talking about mushrooms. As I mentioned briefly earlier, mushrooms are just the reproductive structure that only exists for a relatively small period in the life cycle of most fungi. The vegetative body, which is the main body, that's called a thallus. And the thallus of a fungi may be multicellular or it may be unicellular. There are several unicellular fungi, which we generally term as yeasts. So some people make the mistake of thinking that yeasts are bacteria because they're unicellular organisms. They are actually eukaryotic and they are fungi. Most fungi, however, are multicellular. These multicellular fungi display two distinct morphological stages. That's the vegetative state and the reproductive state. The vegetative body being a thallus, the reproductive body being what people commonly associate with fungi and mushrooms. Now, as for the thallus itself, you guys have probably seen them. Who here has never seen a fungal thallus? Who here has had some red mold in the cover? You've seen a fungal thallus. So, the thallus is generally made up of a lot of filamentous thread-like structures that we call hyphae. When you pull the bread loaf out, it looks like it's got green fur or gray fur or something on it. That's what you're actually looking at. Each individual hair-like structure is a hypha, plural hyphae. A large mass of hyphae is called a mycelium. That's the main body of the fungus. That's the vegetative part of the life cycle. That's the actual body of the organism. The mycelium can grow on a surface. It can grow in a substance. You may have found mold just on the outside of your bread. You may have thought, oh, crap, maybe I can just cut that off. The bread on the inside is still good. And then you open it up and there's more mold in there. They can grow inside the substrate that they're eating. They can grow in a liquid. They can grow on top of living tissue. These things can grow in a lot of different places. Now, when you look at that mycelium on the bread, what's actually happening there? What's it doing?
Eating bread.
Yeah, it's eating the bread. So the fungus that's growing on that surface is actively eating it. So basically it got to the bread before you did. But this is generally I mean, they often look very different, but this is generally what a mycelium will look like. You've probably seen something similar to that on a loaf of bread, something like that, or maybe on some cheese in your fridge. Now, a single mycelium can be exceedingly large. When I say large, I mean the largest living organism known on Earth is a fungus up in Oregon. It's one of these guys. This is a honey mushroom. Now, the mushroom itself, remember, is just a reproductive structure that gets sent up during the reproductive portion of the life cycle. So the actual body of the fungus is much larger. In this case, the individual fungus I'm talking about is 2.4 miles wide, and it covers over 2,000 acres, or roughly 3.5 square miles. That's one single fungus. It's that big. It's thought to be about 2,400 years old. Yes?
How do we figure that out? How do we map that?
I would imagine it was done with genetic evidence. They probably sequenced the genome of samples taken from all over that area and found they all had identical DNA. Would be my guess. Cool stuff, though. Now, it probably doesn't surprise anyone that fungi tend to thrive in environments that are moist. They also tend to thrive in environments that are slightly acidic. Now, those environments can be exposed to light or they can be dark. It doesn't really matter for fungi. As long as it's wet and slightly acidic, they can grow there. They don't need light because they're not plants. The fungus growing in the space in between my ceiling and my upstairs neighbor's floor doesn't get a lot of sunlight, but it grows very well nonetheless because they're bathroom shower things. Most of them, you have a question?
Yeah.
Okay.
So is this why something like gangrenous infection or trench foot or something is a fungal infection and not like bacteria or?
Now, gangrene, I actually don't know off the top of my head whether that's fungal or bacterial, but like trench foot or athlete's foot or jock itch, those are all fungal infections. I actually had mushrooms growing down out of my ceiling for a while. That was fun. Now, most fungi are obligate aerobes, meaning they require oxygen. This makes sense because they're heterotrophic. Most heterotrophs use cellular respiration. Cellular respiration requires oxygen as that final electron acceptor. No oxygen, no aerobic cellular respiration. There are some exceptions, though. So there are fungi that live in the stomach system of cattle. Those are obligate anaerobes, meaning they cannot survive in the presence of oxygen. There are several different classifications here. Aerobes can't survive without oxygen. Obligate anaerobes can't survive with it. There are things that are called facultative anaerobes, which survive better without oxygen but can still tolerate its presence. Yeasts are an example of something, of another classification here. So yeasts can handle either the presence or the absence of oxygen. They do better in the presence of oxygen when they can use aerobic cellular respiration. But in the absence of oxygen, they can still obtain energy from their food through fermentation. Who remembers the difference between fermentation and cellular respiration? So you remember you have those 3 stages in cellular respiration. You have glycolysis, then you have pyruvate oxidation in the citric acid cycle, and then you have oxidative phosphorylation. In the absence of oxygen, the only one of those you can actually carry out is glycolysis. But if you're doing glycolysis and not going into pyruvate oxidation, then you need something else to recycle those electron carriers back to their initial state so you can reuse them. That's where the 2 types of fermentation come in. Yeast use alcohol fermentation, which is why we can use them to produce things like beer. We basically force them into an anaerobic environment. They survive using alcohol fermentation, and then they make delicious, delicious beer. Now, when it comes to growth and reproduction of fungi, they can reproduce either sexually or asexually. In both cases, though, it involves the use of spores. Spores are somewhat analogous to seeds in that they can be spread and germinate and grow into adults, but they're much smaller and much simpler than seeds. In this case here, we have the giant puffball mushroom. Anybody ever seen one of these things? Yeah, they grow where I'm from originally, up in the Portland area. We'd find them out in the forest, and you could poke them and they'd break, and this dust would come out. And that dust was actually trillions of fungal spores. So I don't know if it was a great idea for us to be doing that now. Anyway, this enormous number of spores increases the likelihood that at least a few of them are going to land somewhere where they're in a good environment to grow into an adult fungus. This is really an extreme example of the shotgun approach. You're going to produce trillions of spores with the hope that maybe a few of them end up growing into adults. As far as obtaining nutrition, I've already mentioned that they're heterotrophs, just like animals. However, that's about where the similarity ends. So how do we get our energy? We eat it. What does that mean?
Put it through our digestive system.
Yeah, we put it in our mouths, we chew it up, we swallow it, it gets broken down in our stomachs, where it then gets passed on to the small intestine, where the nutrients get absorbed, and then the waste ends up being excreted through the large intestine. Fungi digest things outside of the body. So you may have wondered why they tend to grow in this really filamentous thread-like structures, the hyphae. This is why. So the way they actually eat is they will release exoenzymes outside of their body, which will then digest food molecules in their environment, break it down into smaller nutrients, which can then be absorbed through the surface area of the mycelium, or of those hyphae. So when those thread-like structures are growing through whatever their growth medium is, the strategy behind that is to maximize surface area. The higher the surface area to volume ratio, the more efficient they're going to be at nutrient uptake. Does that make sense? So if you're digesting stuff outside of your body and absorbing it through your skin, it pays to have as much skin as possible. Now, most fungi are something that we call saprophs, sometimes also called saprophages. This means they get their nutrition from decaying matter. So things that are generally they get their nutrition from things that are already dead and are starting to decay. In the case of fungi, that's mostly plant matter. So when animals die and get broken down, they tend to be decomposed more by prokaryotes like bacteria. You don't see a whole lot of fungus growing on dead meat. One of the cool things that fungi can do is they can break down some of the insoluble polysaccharides, like cellulose and lignin. So we can't digest cellulose. Everybody knows that, right? We can't digest lignin either.
That's like basically fiber.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We call it insoluble fiber, cellulose. So like if you eat a whole bunch of celery, you're not going to get a whole lot of nutrition out of that because it's primarily cellulose and basically no starch. Lignin, I mentioned that briefly, I think a couple weeks ago when I was talking about plants. So what lignin is it's a much tougher substance that some plants reinforce their cell walls with, and that's what makes wood. So lignin, if plants add multiple layers of lignin to their cell walls, that's what creates the woody structures that you find in trees and shrubs and stuff like that. Obviously, we can't digest that either. Now, I read a while ago that for about the first 40 million years after plants evolved the capability of producing lignin, there was nothing that could break it down. So for 40 million years, dead wood was just piling up until fungi actually evolved to produce an enzyme that could be used to break down that lignin and digest it.
Wouldn't that make areas more susceptible to fires?
I'm sure it did, yes. Now this is part of why fungi are so important as decomposers, because they are the only organisms that are able to break down things like wood. And what they're doing in this case is they're returning the nutrients locked in dead organisms to a state where they are again usable by living organisms. So when things die and break down and the organic molecules get converted back into inorganic nutrients for plants to use, that's bacteria and fungi that are doing that. Without decomposers, we'd all be buried in dead things, and we'd all have nothing to eat, and we'd starve to death. Yes. Oh, do you have a question?
Oh, no.
Does anybody else have a question?
Is there a specific organisms that use by that get environmental control?
Sorry, what?
Is there like do you have like examples for that?
You mean it's like specific fungi? I don't know. But if you ever walk through the woods and see like shelf fungus growing on a dead tree stump, that tells you that there's actually a fungal mycelium inside that tree stump digesting the wood. So I guess shelf fungus is an example. Anything else? Okay. So as far as the actual diversity of the fungi, there are 4 major divisions in the kingdom of fungi, and they're grouped according to their mode of sexual reproduction. So this has been the most useful thing we found so far when classifying fungal species. There's also a 5th group, which is polyphyletic, meaning they don't even come close to sharing a recent common ancestor, and they're not really related at all, and they don't reproduce sexually. So we place them in this 5th other group. Turns out now there's also a 6th group that doesn't match with any of the other 5 that's been relatively recently described. So fungi are quite diverse, often quite distantly related, not as much so with the protists. So within those 4 main groups, we have the Chytridiomycota, they all end in mycota, which is convenient. The Zygomycota, the Ascomycota in the top right there, which are the sac fungi, and the Basidiomycota, which are the ones that produce those mushrooms that everyone so closely associates with the kingdom. Now there are also pathogenic fungi. Everybody remembers what pathogenic means, right? Disease causing. Most plant pathogens are fungi, and most pathogenic fungi are plant pathogens, because they've evolved this mechanism to consume plant tissue that many other organisms don't have. So they have this close relationship with one eating the other, and that can be a huge problem. So fungi often can ruin entire crops. We've just been talking about that Irish potato blight, but it's not just potatoes. It can be all kinds of other crops.
Would that be like a rye?
What?
Isn't there like a fungus that grow on rye for?
I'm sure there is.
Yeah.
There was also a corn blight that hit America in, I think, the 70s, and that one was also a fungus, if I'm not mistaken.
Was it parasite or a fungus which not actually taken?
Well, it's both. It's a parasitic fungus.
I think I remember the person that wrote Alice in Wonderland. There was a connection to the rye that was in the, or the bread that was in the area, and how it produced hallucinogenic effects,
Okay.
and that might have
So that's how
explained.
we came up with those weird ideas.
It could have been, yeah.
Interesting. I hadn't heard that before. I remember fungi definitely played a key role in that story. Anything else before we move on to the next slide? Okay. So, although most of the pathogenic fungi tend to specifically harm plants, there are also fungi that can harm animals. Anybody ever had that one on the top left? Ringworm, yeah, that's a fungus. I remember my senior year in high school, the whole wrestling team got ringworm except for me, because I was the only guy that actually used that spray-on chem shield for practice. Those wrestling mats were gross. I was also the only guy that always wore my headgear, and I had no cauliflower ear. Protective things are important. Anyway, so fungi can colonize animal tissues. That's what these infections are. Like ringworm is a colony of fungus under the surface of your skin. Sometimes it can be more devastating than in other cases. Like ringworm is relatively harmless. You basically just have to wait for it to go away, or it can be treated with certain medications. But in some cases, it can be quite serious. You get fungal infections in lung tissue, for instance, that can cause very serious problems. Now, fungal infections tend to be quite difficult to treat because these are eukaryotic organisms. So the antibiotics that we use to treat bacterial infections are entirely useless against fungi. Fungi can also be poisonous. There are many different types of mushrooms that will kill you if you eat them. There are also lots of beneficial fungi, though. That is a delicious morel mushroom. More importantly though, fungi are important to the ecosystem as decomposers. This is the primary benefit they serve to the rest of the world. But they are often also consumed as food as long as you get the right ones. They happen to be the best pizza topping in the world. That's a scientific fact. They can also be used to make other food, like I was talking about with the yeasts. We use yeast to make bread. We use yeast to make beer. We use yeast to make wine. Fungi are also used to make medicine in many cases. So the first antibiotic we ever developed, penicillin, comes from bread mold, penicillium. It was actually an accidental discovery. The researcher was trying to culture bacteria on auger plates, and the plate accidentally got contaminated with spores from penicillium. And he noticed that there was a buffer zone around where the penicillium were growing where the bacteria would not grow. So that gave him the idea that the fungi was somehow killing the bacteria. So he isolated the compound it was producing, and that gave us our first antibiotic. Really cool stuff. Does anyone have any questions on any of this? Okay, I was up late last night writing this, so I think this is a good place to end for the day, unless anyone has objections.
Do we have quiz on Tuesday?
I would have to check the schedule for that. Let's do it together. I don't think there's a quiz on Tuesday. Let's see.
Yeah, there is.
Oh, there is a quiz on Tuesday, and it's going to cover the stuff we did today and yesterday. Yeah, basically chapter 13. Hopefully, I will also have, well, not hopefully, I will have your quiz graded by Tuesday as well. Just didn't have time to do it last night. Okay, office hours, starting now.